Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm DA Wallach, and I'm here with Parag Khanna. And
Hey,
you say it
how's
that
it going?
way? I pronounced it all correctly?
Sure.
Cosmopolitan pronunciation. And we're going to talk today about a lot of things, but sort of anchor the conversation in your book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, which is coming out. And I just finished it last night. This
Perfect
is
time.
my galley. So the topics are top of mind. Can you maybe just start by telling folks a bit about your personal history, because you are a case in point of someone who has moved, and that seems to undergird a lot of the ways that you think about the world in this book and in your previous work.
Well, thank you, DA. Thanks to everyone out there at LA Live. And I know that you've never seen a cooler background than DA's living room in these talks. So, I actually tend to not bring myself into my books because I don't want people to think that I'm pontificating by anecdotes, right, and extrapolating from anecdote. But in this case, what I do say is that whether or not my life story is unique, I am just one data point of evidence of the value that comes from moving and the virtue of it and the benefits fundamentally of what happens when people move. If there were not those benefits to people migrating throughout their lives, then people wouldn't do it. And yet more and more people do in fact do it. So in my case, I was born in India. I spent my childhood in the United Arab Emirates, Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Then we moved to New York. So I grew up mostly in the US, but also in Germany and elsewhere, and all of the pivots. And I now live in Singapore on the other side of the world. But every time I've made one of these geographical pivots, as I call it, it's obviously been voluntary. And it has improved my life, and it has improved my material conditions and my ability to learn and absorb about the world. So it's been good for me. And again, that applies to, if you think about it, in the 17th century, millions of people, in the 18th century, tens of millions of people, in the 19th century, hundreds of millions of people, and in this century, probably over 1 billion people. But that's going to cover both voluntary and involuntary. We'll obviously get into that. But yeah, so, I write with a certain, let's say, confidence about it because I have lived it.
Right. Let's zoom into what you just glanced over, which is this sort of historical trend around moving. You point out in the book that I think it was in the late 19th century, you had something like 14% of the population who you'd call immigrants. And today it's more like 3%. But obviously the population is much bigger. So in absolute terms, I don't know how they compare. Are we, in your view, sort of at the end of a lull in migration? Is that what's going on? Is this the exceptional period that we're in?
People think it's a lull because it's the difference between percent and absolute numbers. So for example, a lot of people say that migration is holding steady. It's 3% of the world population, which is what it was in the 19th century, as you just said, except for the world population has quadrupled over the course of the 20th century. The absolute number of migrants in the world is astronomically higher than it's ever been in history. Therefore, we're not in a lull. We've never been in a lull. Migration has been exploding. And guess what? And this is the beautiful thing. That proves that it's not new. And a lot of people, hear the phrase mass migration and they get freaked out. And they're like, how are we going to handle this? Look at the situation on the Mexican border. Look at the Mediterranean. Hold on a minute. Yes, that's tragic. And that's a lot of people. But for 300 years, Western societies, especially in North America, the US and Canada, have been mass migration societies. We have absorbed hundreds of millions of people, and we've done it very, very, very well. It might be the one thing, because we're terrible at managing climate change, we're terrible at preventing wars. The one thing that human species or our Western societies are very good at doing is absorbing lots of migrants. So we better remember that, because it's not a lull. The numbers are going to explode. We're going to move in this century, probably in the next couple of decades. Now, I'm not talking about 2084, right? I'm talking about 2024, 2034. We're going to cross 1 billion people who are going to be crossing borders, like now. And that's what the book's about.
How does what you've just said cohere? We were talking before the camera started rolling about your friend Tyler Cohen,
right,
who wrote this very interesting book, The Great Stagnation. And one of his claims is that people are not moving as much as they should.
That's
That
exactly right.
in the past, there was this much greater dynamism in society. Part of that dynamism was that people moved to where the work was. And at least in the United States, he argues that has basically ground to a halt in relative terms.
He's absolutely right. So we're talking to Tyler Cowen, the great economist, and Tyler and others have pointed out that if you look at the 20th century, whether it's the early part of the 20th century when you had the Pacific expansion, right, or especially in the 1960s with the completion of the interstate highway system, the percentage of Americans who moved, who relocated every year, reached almost 20% of the American population was moving and really filling out America and suburbanizing and all of those things. And that, again, was chasing economic opportunity. We are all economic migrants, whether we move domestically or internationally. But the phrase that we now use to describe American society, especially pre-pandemic, is stuck in place. People have not been moving because they aren't aware of the opportunities or because they can't afford to move. And that's the ultimate irony. You should move to a place where there's a better job that pays higher wages, but you can't even afford to make that one move that would get you out of that rut. And that's the situation many Americans have been in. Now, since the pandemic broke out, the irony is that people have been moving, right? The rate of American people relocating during the pandemic is way higher than before the pandemic. You would think, how does that compute given that we're supposed to have been locked down? But of course, those who can afford to, I'm saying I'm going to move to suburbia, I'm going to leave the overpriced Bay Area and move to Boise, Idaho, or move to Miami or whatever, move to Texas, low tax places, sunny places, suburban places, upgrade your home. There's been a lot of that, but let's remember, we're still not talking about the average, or we should say the median American, right? The median American still can't afford to just say, oh, lovely, a pandemic has broken out, and let's see, I've lost my job, and I may get foreclosed or get evicted, but now maybe I'll upgrade my home. No. So let's think about the average American and appreciate that that person is still kind of stuck. And what we need to do is have enough affordable housing in the right places where jobs are plentiful so that people can get unstuck.
I want to talk about some tensions that I see in the book. And what's interesting is that, as you just described, there are some populations that are self-motivated to move for tax benefit. And these seem to be sort of elites. There are other elites who are kind of the archetypical globalists, as Steve Bannon would frame them, who just don't believe in countries. They're the young, global, connected MBA types you talk about. And then there are, on the other end of the spectrum, folks who have to move because they're pushed out by climate changes, they're pushed out by geopolitical conflict. And how do you reconcile the idea that moving is good and that we are, as you put it, really good at absorbing people in many different places, with the fact that some people don't want to move? And maybe it's a bad thing that they have to.
So it can be a bad thing that people have to involuntarily move because they're becoming climate refugees. However, it is a good thing if we enable them to move so that they do not die. So I don't view this as a need to reconcile elites versus climate refugees. I view it as a need to urgently categorize and rationalize and sort of come to appreciate that there are many, many categories of people moving, and we have to do whatever we can to enable greater opportunity for them, right? And let's just take the nuances within this category of globalists and elites and MBAs. It isn't just rich Americans or Europeans who want to have 5 passports and tax arbitrage their properties, and the home that they own in Bermuda is registered in Ireland or Cayman Islands. There's that. And there's a few million people like that. Now, let's be clear, just because it's numerically a few million people, we live in a very unequal world. So actually those people are very disproportionately influential. So even if it's just a few million out of a world population of 8 billion, it doesn't mean it's insignificant. It's very significant. And the fact that governments and changing their policies and laws to attract them is very material, because it changes where investments flow. And it's not all tax shelters. The fact is that It also applies to countries that are looking for young students to offer them a low tax lifestyle and offer nomad visas, right? And some of the same countries are doing this. If you look at Indonesia, Indonesia is a poor country, but now you have Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley is their effort to say, we used to have a thriving tourism industry before the pandemic. We have no more people. We are actually destitute at a per capita level. We need to bring in young people who are cost conscious, not elites and billionaires. It could be struggling, postgraduates who need to pay off their student loans. And if you take the Silicon Valley visa, you can live super cheap, a lot cheaper than San Francisco, do some remote work, save money, be paying off your American college loans. Those people technically, according to a lot of people's understanding, fit in the same category. They're rootless globalists. No, they're actually your average, still poor and struggling 20-something Western millennial, young millennial, who's looking at their run rate in terms of what they can earn and what they can save so that they're not in debt forever. So we can't, impute certain characteristics to people based solely upon where they live or where they've gone. And then, yes, again, climate migrants, a huge part of the book, of course, is climate adaptation. And the surest way to ensure a person's survival in an age of climate change is not to go to the COP summit in Glasgow, Scotland, and to sign declarations. It's to move them. So I'm making a moral case here on behalf of hundreds of millions of people. Don't pretend that just because your government has signed an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, that you've done something for the people of the Maldives or Vanuatu or the Caribbean. You haven't. If you want to help them, you're going to help them move and relocate. And you're going to do so in a dignified way. You're going to create visa schemes for them. You may even give them citizenship. Now, actually, America, to bring it back home, does a lot more than people think, because there have been devastating natural disasters, type hurricanes in the Caribbean, obviously earthquakes and so forth, whether it's Haiti, whether it's Bermuda, Bahamas, all of these, whenever those happen, those people come to America, hundreds of thousands at a time, actually. And America always absorbs them, always. We don't send them back, right? So I think we have to remember that we're doing this in an organic way, given proximity. And that's probably what's going to happen in the world. Like, you may have heard that New Zealand has issued these climate visas. So there's basically, to put it in a nutshell, there's like an open invitation. If you're from a South Pacific island, that's where sea levels are rising, and it's going to sink, you're going to lose your home eventually. New Zealand has said, look, you can come tomorrow, or you can come in 10 years, doors open, get on a plane, one-way ticket, you can live in New Zealand the rest of your life. You're going to have a pathway to citizenship, right? India should do that for the Maldives. We should do that for Caribbean countries. And one, kicking or screaming, whether Steve Bannon is alive or not alive, right, we are going to do that, right? We are. There's no question that we are going to do it. So the question is, should we plan for that, create the legal structures for that, or should we react in a haphazard way? And if you look at the Mexican border right now, a lot of those people are directly or indirectly climate migrants.
Right. I'm personally attracted to the picture of immigration in which it is purely to the benefit of the receiving country to take on people. And you, in the book, describe multiple of these groups of migrants who are solely going to add value,
right?
From doctors and nurses who shore up scarcity in those labor markets in a country like America or Japan, to even these tax haven seekers who are going to bring a lot of investment.
Right.
And I take your point that there might be younger, nominally struggling people, right, who have big futures ahead of them, and countries would be wise to capture. But it does seem to me that we also can't deny that some folks who are going to be forced into or self-propelled into migration may not have much to offer.
Right.
And I'm interested in how you, if you were consulting a government, right, would speak to them about the combination of their moral duty, right, to those who will be perhaps a net economic, right, loss for, right, them.
It's a great question.
We can't just say that they're, right, that none of them will be an economic
Right.
loss.
Yeah.
And just because they're an economic loss, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have
Right.
to
Right.
take people on.
But I think your phrasing is very neutral, the way you've articulated it, which is very nice, I mean, because people get very emotional about this. They say, what about the Afghan refugees, who are groping women in the Christmas markets in Germany? And I have a lot of sympathy for that cultural backlash, right? Because they have a right to say, wait a minute, we have worked for centuries, certainly decades, to build very stable welfare states, for our nationals, for our citizens, in which they have a right to law and order and security. And as much as we're doing the right thing humanitarily to bring in, political refugees, in this case from Syria or Afghanistan, our women, our children should not feel threatened, or also our men, in terms of, rising gang violence and crime and criminality. And I've witnessed this firsthand in Germany, because I went to high school there in the 90s, and you go to Germany today in the 2020s, and it's a very diverse polyglot country. It's certainly not the Germany that they thought Germany would be in the 50s, and certainly not even in the 90s after reunification, but that's what it's become. It's not a lawless, violent society by any stretch, right? But it's terra incognita culturally, right, in terms of where they're going. And so I have a lot of sympathy for this. It happens to be what I actually do, is work with governments on this issue. But now let's be clear about, just to reestablish the fact of the matter, which is that if you look at Western Europe, we're talking about 700 million people, abysmal fertility, aging populations, very high dependency ratio in the economy, meaning young people have to pay a lot into already high tax systems to care for the elderly, which they will themselves also become eventually. And they need migrants, they need laborers, right? The trash does not get collected in Naples, Italy. Why? Italians won't do it, only migrants will do it. If you don't let in migrants, your trash doesn't get collected. Are you still a civilized society if you haven't figured out how to let in the people who will collect your trash? I would hazard to say you're kind of losing the plot a little bit. So why aren't we committing more resources? If assimilation is a problem, does that mean it doesn't have a solution? Because it actually does. If you look at Germany, if you look at the Netherlands, they train people in the language. They give them skills. The reason the labor force in Germany, and this is not an unimportant country, we're talking about the most important country in Europe by far, the reason it's the only economy with a rising labor force, with higher output, is because they've absorbed millions of migrants, including Syrian refugees, who are now trained to build the rail cars that when you go Euro railing in Europe, right? You, the backpacker, the proverbial backpacker, you're riding a train which a Syrian refugee had a role in building, because they put the money and the effort in training. So the reason I give that example is because actually everyone has something to contribute. Not just someone who was already high skilled as a software programmer in Syria and then wound up there. No, everyone does. Now let's say Greece and Italy. Greece and Italy are currently either bribing militias from North African governments to shoot and kill migrants who are coming over in rafts, or they're putting them into these, deplorable, sort of camps and mistreating them and harassing them in their own country. Do you know that Greece and Italy have highly unproductive agriculture? They have agriculture as a key part of their economies, but they have shortages of farmers in their own countries. So I would say, if I was advising is a strong, because I'm very technocratic, so this is what I would force them to do. I would like, Angela Merkel style, I would say, you are going to take these Syrians, you are going to take these Egyptians and Eritreans, and you're going to turn them into farmers. Because guess what? Everyone can be a farmer, if nothing else. I don't care if you're not a doctor. I don't care if you don't know how to code in Python. You can be a farmer. You can work on that farm, and you can help Greece, generate more agriculture, bottle its own olive oil, and start to pay down its debt, which is like hundreds of % of its GDP. So it can be done. Don't tell me that your culture, that it's an affront to your culture, because your culture, among other glorious cultural inventions, is also a lot of lazy people who are not working hard enough. And you need to do something about it, because other people are actually paying for you to not pay your debt.
Do you think, though, this can veer into a sort of internal colonialism, in the sense that, if the attitude is at once help these people by giving them a new home and training them. But really the reason you should do it is because it's good for you. And you can exploit the fact that they are low income earners, that they don't have highly marketable skills today. What does that look like in the absence of a social mobility regime? Because at the same time, you know, that these migrants are upon the doorsteps of the Greeces and Italys and Americas of the world, our societies are less and less capable of taking even our own native-born citizens and allowing them to move up the ladder.
So just because we've been very poor at social mobility, and it's our own fault because we've allowed inequality to be exacerbated by financial capitalism and the erosion of our educational system and our industrial base and all the things we haven't done. Those are at least things where we can say, God, that's not the migrants' fault, that's our own fault. And we've been making that mistake for decades. And it doesn't mean it's something we can't fix. And it doesn't sort of obviate the point that domestic workers and foreign workers tend to not compete for the same jobs in the economy. The fact is that if you take, sort of underclass white person who is not working or whatever, that person is still not going to become a garbage man, right? They just won't do it, right? You can train them for other things, hopefully, and get them into the labor force, but they're not going to want to be a garbage man, right? So the fact is you actually need immigrants to do that. Now, we're not having a hypothetical conversation because actually, if you look at, a lot of Latin Americans and a lot of Filipinos in this country don't necessarily have high social mobility, but they're still providing essential functions in our economy. Look at the nurses in our hospitals, and then look at what just happened with COVID in our hospitals and nursing homes. Ask yourself this, would we or would we not have been better off with hundreds of thousands, not thousands, hundreds of thousands of more Mexican and Filipino and other women or men who could be nurses and caregivers and help our elderly? And the problem is not going to go away. We are going to need more and more as baby boomers, sort of age and retire. And we're not dealing with that. And how many, even if you took the unemployment rate as it is today, are all of those people coming off the bench to become nurses? No. Right. But let's go back to the point about, European countries and whether or not one is even civilized if you're not caring. Europe's aging crisis is a little bit more advanced than ours right now. And this happens in America too. But in Europe today, old people die alone. In Japan, in Europe, well, it's weeks, months go by, and literally they're rotting corpses. And we don't want to talk about these. It's not a comfortable thing, but it's a very painful fact. I don't want my parents to die alone. I don't think anyone wants their parents to die alone. It happens all the time, though, because of broader sociological phenomena. Younger people moved out of the house, they moved to the big city, the smaller towns are dwindling in population. It's the same in America, but we're not bringing in the people to care for the old people. That's not nice.
Which I guess what I'm getting at though is what should the deal be with those migrants? I mean, the invitation is not come to America and join our permanent underclass of nursing home employees. It should be hopefully come here. We've got a great job for you right now, or at least a better job than what you had before. We really need this labor. But if you do it, not only is this your new home, but there's a path forward for you. What should that path forward look like in these advanced industrial economies for migrants? And can you point to an example where it's worked beautifully? I mean, I think by contrast, say, of some of the Arab states, where sure, you've got this thriving population of expatriate, effectively indentured servants who are making low incomes, but better than Bangladesh, and they're sending back 90% of their money to the family at home. That doesn't seem like a great permanent stasis for those people to achieve.
I think it's a great point. So first of all, we don't actively deny people mobility when they come here as migrants, in the sense that if they're legal migrants, then there's eventually a pathway to citizenship, right? And obviously there may be cultural obstacles, right? In corporate hierarchies and elsewhere to those people's mobility. But let's take the example, of course, of Indians. A lot of Indians did come in the 60s, 70s. When my family came, we moved to America in 1983. Fine, my parents were skilled, but the waves in the 60s and 70s of Latin Americans and Asians who came weren't all computer programmers, right? You know, semi-skilled in most cases, right? And they've run pharmacies and, you know, motels and whatever. But as you know, Indian Americans are the wealthiest demographic in the United States today. And there wasn't a deal. Deal was simply, you're here, you're legal, get to it. Right?
How much of that, I mean, do we have the evidence at this point to understand how much of that was sort of destined by virtue of the caliber of people coming versus, you know, the opportunity that we created?
Well, I mean, there's an ethic. It's not the Protestant ethic in the case of Hindus, but it's an ethic, of course. And then, of course, there's cultural bonds, there's diaspora networks, there's all of these certain, you know, maybe commercial sense.
I understand if you look at who they were in India.
Right. But they weren't rich, they weren't wealthy, right? Again, when we look at the Silicon Valley CEO today, we see someone who's a graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology and Indian Institute of Management. I'm going to the 1960s here, the 1970s, right? My mom happens to be an IIT graduate, but she had to work her way up to get a whole new degree because her degree wasn't recognized at the time. So she went back to Pace University, you know, and worked her way up corporate ladder all over again. So of course there are going to be cultural attributes to it, but the fact is that in America today, there's plenty of people who've come from impoverished backgrounds, whether it's from the Arab world or Africa or Latin America, and have made it to the top of American society. So it's possible. It's certainly more possible in America if it doesn't reflect in terms of the statistical number of people from poor countries who've made it to, it's also because we're a very large country, right? And already a very wealthy economy. So don't use the percentage penetration of minorities as your absolute judgment or in a way, you know, sort of condemnation, not that you are, but condemning, but that we haven't done enough for social. We can always do more for social mobility. But you obviously have Turks in Germany who are now in part. Germany just had an election. They have the most diverse parliament in history. It's unbelievable. 20-25% of the Germany here. Think of what would we say about Germany 100 years ago. Today, 25% are people with migrant backgrounds from the Balkans, Arabs, Africans, you name it, Vietnamese in the German parliament. So it's possible anywhere, you know. Now, I do think it's worth addressing the places that are permanently, rigidly stratified, because interestingly, even there's mobility. So I actually spent my childhood in the United Arab Emirates, know it very well. There are certain places in the world, like Singapore and the UAE. I happen to live in Singapore now, so these are two interesting cases. Now, let's bear in mind, caveat emptor, these are small countries, but they're representative of global nodes in geographies where the first and third worlds come together. And there may be more of this in the future as we have more labor migrants and a need, you know, to invest in infrastructure and you know, care for the elderly and so forth. Believe it or not, in the UAE today, and I'm not talking about, you know, say construction workers, but who you know, are again, bonded laborers. There's no other way to put it, right? So you're right about that. But it used to be that the UAE government looked very askance at these Indians and Pakistanis. Like, okay, fine, we'll tolerate you, we're rich in oil, we need to build stuff, we have very few people. Fast forward to today, 90% of the population of the United Arab Emirates, of 11 million people, is non-Emirati. And a lot of those are Arab, but the majority of the total population is Indians and Pakistanis who are in the middle class now. Like, they fulfill all the civic functions in the entire country. And they'll never be citizens, although believe it or not, and the numbers now are just a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand. But here you have a country that we think of as being obviously a tribal society, incredibly hierarchical, is actually beginning to modernize. They are literally giving citizenship of the United Arab Emirates, a passport with Arabic script to Indians, because they've been there so long, they recognize their contributions, and they know that they actually want to maintain the loyalty of those migrants because they're investors in those societies. And if those people were to say, I'm going to pick up and move to Europe now, it would be a loss for them. So psychology changes. I'm describing reality today. They used to say that, oh, well, we definitely don't want old people coming here because that's a cost center. You know, that's a welfareism. Now they've realized, oh, wait a minute. There is an expanding middle class in Africa and in India and Pakistan. and the pollution there is really bad and the corruption is very high. We have been building these hospitals and medical clinics and retirement colonies here. Let's actually take them as money. Let's take their money. Let's treat them as investors. So they've changed the laws.
This gets at a question of how countries actually absorb folks from other places. And I'll try and frame this and where you sit in this maybe polarized debate historically in the following way. Historically, you've essentially had, at least in the United States, some part of the population that is really mad about, say, Mexican immigration on the basis that these people come here and they don't assimilate. They end up living in siloed communities, they don't learn English, they don't become a part of the economy. That's been one view. That's sort of the archetypically conservative anti-immigration view. On the other hand, you've had the sort of melting pot view that this is a great thing for our culture because our culture is inherently syncretic. These people are going to come here, they're going to learn English, but they're also going to give us some of their Mexican food and tradition and religiosity, and it's going to be a great thing for even the folks who were here before. It now seems that you have a young, let's call it progressive left in America and elsewhere that really likes the idea of immigration, but they don't like the idea of assimilation. What they like is the idea that people's identities are permanently defined by their origin, and that essentially what's good about bringing new people to the party is that they're going to continue speaking Spanish and doing the things that they did back home. And we actually, above all else, need to respect that and protect it. You are somewhere else in the sense that you do seem to want assimilation. You seem to think that the great examples of countries are those who have successfully assimilated migrants. How does that factor into this idea of cultural preservation of any kind?
So it's a historical fact going back thousands of years, of course, that the most successful empires, the Romans, the Mongols, and of course ours, have been those that assimilate migrants and forge a national, if not, obviously not ethnic, but a civic, identity and patriotism. So there's no question that that is what has helped America succeed. It has simultaneously also had cultural preservation. I don't think it's fair to call it ghettos, right? There is a thriving, of course, Latino, African, other Indian too, cultures, Chinese, of course, in America in parallel, because we're a vast, country and a free country. But you also have assimilation. So you have both. So I think you've rightly framed ideologically what sound like hardened camps, and on paper they may be, but in reality we are a melting pot while also having certain salad bowls. LA is a great example of it. I mean, why not just look at LA and look at Miami, and New York, right? In LA, in Miami, in New York, you can have your, cute, your little Havana and so forth, and your Koreatown, but you also have a thriving, commingled, assimilated LA community. So both are perfectly plausible, and so I don't think it has to be an either or.
But where it gets contentious politically is always around, should the street signs be in the second language?
Right. Okay.
How do you actually deal with those meat and potatoes issues?
No, so okay, look, I mean, I remember in the 1990s, the first time I ever came to Los Angeles to visit friends, bilingualism was a huge, debate. And a friend of mine's sister was teaching in a bilingual school. And I remember we went and spent the day there. And it was great. I'd been learning Spanish anyway in middle school. I was like, I got a chance to, try my Spanish. And the kids, she explained to me that kids do half the day in English and half the day in Spanish, and helps them assimilate. This remains contentious, but I tend to be of the view, and maybe this is colored a bit by looking at the European example, but America too. Ask yourself, how far can a person get in the country, anywhere in the country, if they should be forced to or choose to relocate, right, without knowing the national language, without being fluent in the national language, right? So behind the veil of ignorance, let's say, right, I drop a Mexican, American who's been, raised in a comfortable parallel Spanish-speaking sort of community. Then I say, there's a great job for you. Your skills are needed in building new housing up in the Great Lakes region. Off you go, but you don't speak any English, right? Uh-oh, are you really going to thrive in Michigan, right? Probably you're not. How far is a Turkish migrant to Germany going to get if they grow up in a parallel Turkish community and never learn German? The most they're ever going to achieve is to be a taxi driver, right? And you see this in Germany all the time. The language matters a lot. So fine, you can have signs in 8 languages if you want to. Go to San Francisco, you've got everything in Vietnamese and in English. Do you really think the young Vietnamese American is reading the Vietnamese sign for, like, get off at San Mateo or whatever, or San Jose? No, they're not reading the Vietnamese sign. So we graduate beyond that as well. Again, I as a migrant myself, my English was pretty terrible when we moved to America. My German was terrible when I moved to Germany. Today, Germans treat me like a German, language matters incredibly. And so, I get cultural preservation, sure. So, again, we should not be, we don't forcibly annihilate foreign cultures when they arrive. I mean, in what other country do you have every conceivable, ethno-linguistic group having their national days and parades? So why these things get framed as opposites, as irreconcilable opposites by people who maybe don't know their history very well, who are fighting a local battle but rareifying it into a national debate. And I get that the local circumstances may not be as favorable to the cultural preservation that they seek to promote. But when you want to have a coherent, integrated society, right? And we know that that's a problem right now, right? I think it has to have a common language.
So we're about to go in this conversation on a world tour. Excellent. We're going to condense half of your book into 5 minutes. And I want to start with China.
Right.
And we'll begin as a segue with the language issue. Right. I remember reading a book of interviews with Lee Kuan Yew, the father of modern Singapore. And he said, and it stuck with me, that the biggest mistake Chinese leadership made was not adopting English as the language, because if they had done that, by his reasoning, they would have been unstoppable in terms of attracting global talent.
Right.
And Mandarin is just too hard.
Yeah.
It was his
firsthand. He had a hard time learning.
Do you agree that that was a mistake on China's part? And then let's, from that, grade China's prospects going forward in the framework that you've laid out of who will win and lose in the next 100 years.
So, I mean, obviously one can get where Lee Kuan Yew was going with that as an Anglophone, sort of person, and thinking, I guess, in his view, strategically about what would be in the best interest of China from the standpoint of, global capital markets and so forth.
Sure.
But you're also talking about the world's oldest and deepest and largest contiguous linguistic zone. And so they're not exactly going to switch from Mandarin to English. And what their solution has been is to train, the talent domestically, and to lure back quite a few, in fact, not quite a few, hundreds of thousands of overseas Chinese who are highly talented and successful, have gone back to China to work there. So China has not been inhibited in its material progress by not having adopted the English language as a lingua franca, as much as that would have been an interesting thought experiment. China is China, but obviously the efforts that people are making to learn Chinese are really remarkable, given how impossible a language it is. My kids have been learning Chinese for 8 years every day and can't speak a sentence.
What is your summary take on China's global ambitions?
Right.
I remember reading a book Fareed Zakaria wrote years ago, and he said, look, they don't want to set up an empire. They are the empire. Yeah. And they just want to keep everyone out of it, in a sense.
There's a difference between an empire and imperialism. China is an empire. In fact, by proper definition, the European Union is an empire. Right? It's a polyglot, multi-ethnic, multinational federation with now something of a hierarchical set of institutions. But it's not imperialist anymore, right? They're kind of done with that. So China is, does not seek administrative control and sort of direct foreign occupation and rule, of the territories where it has influence and dependence on supply chains, like African countries for minerals. But it does seek to influence their behavior for the sake of the stability of those trade routes. So it is mercantile, not colonial. In a nutshell, almost everything China does around the world is mercantile, but not colonial. The fear that people have is that, well, that's actually how the Dutch and the Spanish empires began, and the British too. They began as mercantile operations. Think of the East India companies, the Dutch and the British East India companies, but they became colonial. But I do think that, it's not part of China's, culture, if you will, to want to do that, or even, again, it's not within its capacity. And it comes back to language, because really you're never going to get anyone to learn Mandarin. It's never going to, but because you may remember that we had this debate about global languages, like, China is rising so fast. Is Chinese going to replace English as a global language, or be in parallel to global language? That was never going to happen.
Right.
English and math are the only two global languages, and you can pretty safely say for the remainder of this century, because it's so interesting, look at Europe. In the 90s, people said it's going to be French or German that will dominate the European Union. It's English, because when an Estonian and a Romanian and a Portuguese and Italian get together in a room, the common denominator is not French or German. It's English.
Okay, so we're going to go on our world tour now. We'll come back to Estonia, which you just mentioned at the end.
By the way, you wouldn't know how much of this book is about the Arctic from this conversation.
Oh, there's so much about the Arctic. So here's what we're going to do. Because I know you can talk about each of these places endlessly.
I love them all.
I'm restricting you to winner, loser, medium.
Ooh, win, lose, or draw. Okay.
Win, lose, draw.
Win,
Okay.
Lose, or draw. Okay.
Australia.
Both.
We're talking over the next 50, 100 years. Relative to today.
Economic winner, climate loser.
Okay. South America.
Loser.
Canada.
Winner.
Central America.
Loser.
United States.
Winner.
UK.
Winner.
Arctic.
Big winner.
Big winner.
Yeah.
Russia.
Winner.
Southeast Asia.
Draw.
Japan.
Win/draw.
India.
Loser.
Bhutan.
Winner.
And finally, Estonia.
Big winner.
Big winner.
Yeah.
Now, I want to dig into Estonia a little bit, because there are some speculations. Years ago, you introduced me to Balaji.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a fascinating guy and a very iconoclastic thinker. And there was some of him in the section on Estonia and on the idea of crypto states.
That's right.
Talk to us about what Estonia specifically is doing, and how they're a case example of this sort of new conception of what a country may be in the future.
So, Estonia, people think of the caricature, and it's not totally inaccurate, as a place that took a really radical path 30 years ago upon independence, being thrust into independence and winning its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they basically became, digital first kind of republic. And part of it has to do with political factors in terms of the lustration of the Soviet elite. So all these Eastern European former Soviet republics had some caste that was, still Soviet inclined. And lustration is the term for ejecting those figures and never letting them be involved in politics. And you can track the path of former Soviet republics based upon what happened to those. At least in our modern context, we call it, we would look at Iraq and say de-Baathification, right? The Iraqi Ba'ath Party that Saddam Hussein run, de-Baathification meant eliminating anyone who had any ties to the regime, but then you were left with no one who knew how to run a country. Estonia had people who knew how to run a country, but didn't have as many people who were loyal, because they're not ethnic Russians. They have their own national identity, their own language and culture. Estonians are related to Finnish people much more. It's their closest, anyway, we're going a bit too much into the ethnography of Estonia. But anyway, digital first, Estonia as it's known, everything online, sort of digital governance and so forth. And now nomad visas, they invented the kind of nomad visa and said, you know what? here's our flat tax regime, wherever you are in the world, come and be a sort of a digital citizen of Estonia, even without ever entering Estonia, do your business in Estonia and access the European Union in that way. And now physically come and live in Estonia as long as you want and register your business here, get paid here. And so they've attracted digital nomads. Now, before the pandemic, fun fact, there were basically 1 or 2 countries that had digital nomad visas. Today, right now, as we sit here with the pandemic still sort of, raging, there are 75 countries with digital nomad visas, because everyone has said, wait a minute, we want to attract young, talented people, right? We need those people staying in our Airbnbs and going around in our taxis and eating in our restaurants and using our Wi-Fi and, spending in our economy. And so Estonia, yet again, has sort of led the way in how we not only digitize our economies and our public services, but how we think about labor, geography, and the digital domain in that triangle.
So give us some concepts from the future of what countries may look like, of what international or national institutions may look like. You do talk in the book about what the passport and immigration regimes of the future may be.
And that's the one that's most important to me, because it's one thing for one country to do something, but we need to fix systems, right? The entire system, the mobility of human beings on the planet Earth is broken. So it's kind of important, especially if we're moving into a world where more than 1 billion people are going to be crossing borders. Bear in mind, by the way, on the eve of the pandemic, 1.5 billion people had crossed a border in the year 2019, but most of that was voluntary, right? It was, obviously students, travelers, business professionals, whatever the case may be, tourists. But if that's going to happen in a voluntary and involuntary way in the future, we need a better system. So what I advocate in the book, and I've written a couple of articles about this, is that we need to have passport information and the required information for entry be on the blockchain, right? Which is to say that rather than what we have today, which is to go and stand in front of a bulletproof glass window at a consulate or embassy and pay lots of money and fill out paper forms to provide the same information you provided everywhere. Here's my financial history or records, currently, state of play right now, verified. Here's my travel history, criminal history, educational records, vaccine certification. Every country wants the same thing. And you can prove it and verify it by having it in the blockchain. And you can only give access when it's needed in an authorized way and say, please let me in. You have advertised that you need truck drivers in England. England happens to have a shortage of 100,000 truck drivers right now. I should not be penalized by a nationality. If I'm a skilled truck driver in Nigeria and I'm not a criminal, I should be able to go into the UK digital e-entry portal and say, here's my truck driver certification. And Britain should say, boom, cleared. I get my e-visa and I fly to England.
Now, in your future system, what should the qualifications be for social public benefits? Because it's great to say, come into our country when we need truck drivers, but it's another to say, we're happy to pay for your healthcare for the next 15 years. What do you think the future concept of social insurance ought to be?
Right. So let's bear in mind that, I think you're phrasing this again incredibly accurately and neutrally, but there is this perception out there that migrants inherently are a drag on public benefits. And we know from study after study after study from America and European countries, migrants tend to be younger in median age, and they spend years contributing into and benefiting the GDP on a per capita basis of the economies in which they arrive, more than they take out of the system. So just to be clear, so it's not like they're dependents, from day one. But as a rule, yes, I mean, basically anyone who is a legal resident in a country, unless you want to have apartheid, should have access to the same public service.
But how would this sit side by side with something like universal basic income? Imagine that we destigmatize entirely the idea that anyone is a drain, because we all become a drain.
Right.
We agree, that's the definition of our citizenship, is we're all going to be a drain on each other.
Right.
And we're all going to, in doing so, have a minimum standard of income and lifestyle that we view as.
This is a novel justification for universal basic income in the sense that you could say, let's introduce it now as a way of destigmatizing mass migration because we're all going to be dependents and drawing from the system. I love that argument. I think that the UBI advocates should take that
But
up.
let's, what I'm trying to
yeah.
get at is, let's say we did that tomorrow.
Right.
Well, now we've got a society where if you're born on American land or you marry an American,
Right.
you get your UBI. Do we want to extend, on the one hand, the risk is, of course, as you cautioned us against, stigmatize immigrants as, oh, they're going to be the ones who come and take. Well, what about the people who are born here
Right.
and take, but did nothing with their life to contribute?
So
it would seem like we would want to have an even-handed approach to both.
That's a solid rhetorical justification for why it would be unfair to penalize migrants and not give them access to public services, because you've got locals, natives who are drawing on those services and contributing nothing.
So should there be contribution testing?
Well, so that's a different issue because you would retroactively be applying that to your native population. This is never going to fly domestically. I mean, do I think it would?
Well, we do means testing.
Well, so I mean, again, as a way of promoting civic awareness and duty, I would be for it. I'm for national service, right? And national service would apply to everyone. But that's something, again, that people in Congress have been pushing since the early 1990s, and we still don't have national service today. So I don't want to, we can veer into the unrealistic as much as it's plausible and desirable. So, this kind of civic testing and contribution testing and national service, all of these are desirable things that we should have, but we don't. UBI seems like the kind of thing that, because we now increasingly have a world of mobile payments and registered social security accounts, you can rapidly, even India does this. If India can do this, people, right? We can do this, right? India has a universal ID scheme and now digital payments layered on top. So like 1 billion people can just get, rupees put in their account. We need to be doing this.
I mean, you could imagine a way of tracking people's lifetime contribution to all of the world's economies and essentially deeming them as having ultimately substance in one of them more than the others for the purposes of where they participate in, say, a pension system.
Well, governments already do that in order to tax. I was talking to a friend yesterday at the conference who, lives between New Zealand, the UK, and the US, and has passports for 2 of those 3 and residency in the 3rd. All 3 governments are on her case right now. Each wants a pound of flesh. Right, so that's already happening for those people. But you already can, of course, document what taxes you paid and what you earned in each country you were in, because you need it for your next application anyway. So we already have that. We just have it in a paper way, not in a paperless way. But getting back to your point, the reason you want to have today a guaranteed access to basic services, education, healthcare, housing, for everyone who you do legally permit in your country, is simply to prevent them from becoming a drag in fiscal or social ways, because you don't want more homelessness. If you look at Canada, they say if you're in Canada, you may not be a Canadian, but we'd certainly rather that you have the foundation and floor to contribute than not. So everyone gets a home. Like in Canada, they're eradicating homelessness, right? It's like, we don't care whether it's mostly it's economic issues, but it could be mental health, it could be any number of things, but let's just say it's economic. We want to give you the tools to be able to be a contributor, even if you're not. So what are those things? Well, we know that it is home, and it is some access to healthcare, and then some kind of skills training. So they focus on those 3 things, and that's the right way to do it. So that is the logic, even absent our dreams and schemes around UBI and other sorts of things, and sort of virtue tests. The fact is that if we did those things here, we'd actually all wind up better off.
You mentioned the conference, and I think you're referring to the Milken conference, which is taking place here in LA. And I remember at that conference a few years ago, seeing Mike Milken, the ultimate capitalist in a sense.
Well, America has a lot of ultimate capitalists.
A lot of ultimate capitalists, but Mike gave a talk in which he was explaining how alarmed we should all be that a younger generation of Americans is less convinced about capitalism less convinced about American identity. And in your book, you describe this dissolution of ideological zealotry, nationalism, patriotism as something that's pervasive worldwide. And so while we may be seeing these sort of last hurrahs of nativism everywhere, or in many places, India, US, Europe, you're betting that that's the last hurrah, and that this younger generation doesn't care as much about these old orthodoxies. Do you think that is a certainty? And how would you sort of score the probability that we will in fact be entering a world where the next generation is much less concerned with their country and what it means?
So it's a safe bet that certain old orthodoxies are dying based upon their self-definition, right? So, the conventional nationalism of national identity is my only and primary identity is something that is dying off. And you can see that everywhere. And it's very well documented. And I cite all of the sociological research. Remember that millennials and Generation Z today globally are the most surveyed and psychoanalyzed human beings that have ever lived, right? And it's clear that they're more secular, they're less nationalistic, and they're more drawn towards global causes, right? So it's very specifically, not generally, the right to mobility, the right to migration, something they deeply believe in. Sustainability, the right to a safe ecosystem and environment, right? And connectivity as a right. These are the three cardinal virtues of almost every human being under the age of 40 on Earth, irrespective of nationality. Mobility, sustainability, connectivity. Notice I did not say national identity is paramount, and I did not say that religious or ethnic identity is your first identity. So I'm not making that up, right? That is the young world. And you can see it in American elections and voting patterns. You can see it in Brexit and how people voted. You can see it everywhere. So that does not mean that as the young generation gets older and becomes the majority of the human population, that politics will not involve cleavages. There are always going to be divisions, but it's not going to be 19th century kind of ideologies that will be the future divisions. It will be about what is our political economic system? To what extent is free market capitalism going to shape the rules versus other kinds of considerations? And we can see this happening all the time, obviously, in this country and elsewhere. And I think that that's fine. That actually is part of progress, is the debate itself evolving from rehashing old debates versus entering new terrain. We would not have progress if the debates were still the old debates, right? So I do think that that is part of the process.
So what if you are and forgive me if you wouldn't self-identify, but you said you were a technocrat before.
Right.
If you are
I wear that on my sleeve.
If you are a technocratic crypto globalist, you're Steve Bannon's nightmare.
Right.
And you and your cohort win.
Right.
What become the challenges and the excesses of that ideology that the next generation is going to need to manage or contend with?
Well, so, I'm a utilitarian, right? And in this book, I talk about this idea of, cosmopolitan utilitarianism. You're holding all others equal to yourselves, not, denigrating or ostracizing people on the basis of having a different identity or nationality, but you're a utilitarian. You want the greatest good for the greatest number, right? You believe in a system of equal access to resources and of, globally distributed benefit, if not redistribution per se. So it's not the case that I represent, a vanguard of, rootless crypto globalists, right? I mean, those people are there. I certainly sympathize with them, but the purpose of this book is to talk about the future of human geography and to make that future as fair and equitable as possible. So you can have both at the same time. By my advocating blockchain passports, it's not so that the rich person from Luxembourg can have yet more homes and tax havens. It's so that the Nigerian person and the Brazilian person and the Salvadoran person and the Eritrean, right, can have a better life, right? And wherever that may take them. And it will take them to more than one place. Chances are many of us will actually migrate more than once in our lifetimes, whereas in the past, it might have been just a one-way ticket. So we need to create a system like that that benefits everyone, not just, one person or the other. So, again, I do think that there are going to be, the big debates are going to be things that we don't spend as much time on right now, like sustainable resource management and extraction and supply chains and things like this.
Do you support, you mentioned E.O. Wilson's proposal that we assign a large part of the Earth's surface to rewilding?
Right.
Is that something you're in favor of?
So I mean, he actually identified the very geographies of contiguous environmental preservation that would be in the best interest of allowing nature's lungs in a way to sort of breathe freely again. So I'm not going to dispute the kind of biodiversity and the geographies that he's pinpointing. I actually think it's a very valid set of proposals. And this actually brings us back to one of the core points in the book. There are only 8 billion people alive today. And the maximum human population is not likely to even reach 9 billion people. So we have plenty of space in this world. If you took every human being alive on the planet today, I think standing up, we would fit inside Los Angeles, right? And we have 150 million square kilometers of terrain, half of which, let's say, is habitable. So there's plenty of space on this planet for everyone to have a little bit of land and a little plot as a family, right? The question is where. So in a libertarian sense, of course, I want to enable maximum human mobility, but not borderlessness, because you don't want to do things, you want things to be done gradually. Otherwise, you will have tragedy of the commons. Everywhere we go, we destroy. We want to avoid that when we have precious habitable geographies left in the world. Although it's a lot, it's not infinite, right? So yes, I support some mixture of rewilding certain geographies, a technocratic relocation of people towards livable geographies with ample resources, like Russia, like Canada, like Scandinavia. And I know that some people in Scandinavia are not going to like this argument, but it's so funny because that's where Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future and Climate Strike began. And yes, they proffer this solidarity with mankind and the negative climate effects. Like, prove your solidarity. It's actually one of the rallying points in the book. I end one chapter by calling out Greta Thunberg. I'm like, prove your solidarity. How many climate migrants will you accept in Sweden?
Right. And
that, I think, is the real test.
Last question, Parag. Where will you move next?
Well, so I'm happily settled in Singapore, but it is an equatorial country. It is a tropical island. It is exposed to sea level rise. There's no doubt about it. But my plan B, and everyone should have a plan B if you're listening. Everyone needs a plan B. I have mine. Do I have to tell you?
Yeah.
It's Berlin.
Wow. Okay.
So Berlin is a city I've lived in and out for the last 30 years. So it's my home away from home, and it's climate resilient.
Amazing. Parag, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.